Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are opening a file that is, quite frankly, scorching hot.
Yeah, literally scorching hot in some historical periods.
Exactly. I mean, we are looking at the mind of a man whose work was so influential that Pope Benedict XVI called him crucial to the whole development of Christian thought.
Right.
But then he gets completely canceled. I mean, his name was dragged through the mud for centuries. His works were systematically hunted down and burned, and he was straight up anathematized.
Canceled in the most extreme metaphysical way possible. And this is the wild part. This all happened 300 years after he died.
It really is one of the great tragedies and, honestly, great ironies of intellectual history. We're talking, of course, about Origen of Alexandria.
Yes.
And specifically, we are diving into his masterpiece on first principles, or, if you want to be fancy, with the Greek Periarchon.
This is a heavy hitter. It is arguably the most important theological text that most people have never actually read.
And I think what makes this deep dive so essential for you listening today is that we aren't just looking at a collection of old sermons or, some ancient self-help advice.
No, not at all.
We are looking at what is essentially the very first attempt at a systematic theology.
Right. And that term, systematic theology, it gets thrown around a lot in seminary circles, but we really need to define what it meant in the 3rd century.
Because it was groundbreaking.
Completely. Before Origen, you had letters, right? You had defenses of the faith, what we call apologetics, and you had attacks on specific heresies, just sort of whack-a-mole theology. But Origen is doing something completely different here. He is attempting to build a theory of everything.
So he's kind of the Stephen Hawking of the early church.
In a sense, yes. He isn't just looking at one Bible verse or one little moral problem. He's trying to construct a cohesive, interlocking framework that explains God, the soul, the stars, the devil, free will, physics, everything in one logical system.
It's the grand unified theory of the ancient world. He's trying to find the equation that balances the spiritual and the material.
Exactly. But there is a massive twist to this investigation, and this is where the detective story really begins.
Oh, I love this part.
We don't actually have the book.
Right. Let's unpack this right away, because this is a crucial piece of context that just blew my mind when I was going through the prep materials. We are analyzing a book that, strictly speaking, doesn't exist.
Well, the original doesn't exist. Origen wrote this in Greek around the year 220 or 230 AD, but because he was later declared a heretic, mostly for the very ideas in this exact book, the Greek text was largely destroyed.
Wiped out.
Yeah. What we are basing this entire deep dive on is mostly a Latin translation by a man named Rufinus.
And Rufinus isn't just a neutral observer here. He is a character in the drama himself. He's not like a modern translator who tries to be invisible.
Far from it. He wrote this translation around 397 AD, so almost 2 centuries after Origen lived. And in his own preface, which we actually have in the source material, Rufinus basically admits, hey, I fixed some stuff.
Fixed. That is such a loaded word for a translator.
Highly loaded.
That's like a biographer saying, I didn't really like how his life ended, so I just changed the last chapter.
It is. He openly says he smoothed over parts that he thought were heretical or dangerous. His argument was that heretics must have corrupted the text earlier, so he was just, quote-unquote, restoring it.
Restoring it to what he thought it should say.
Exactly. In reality, historians are pretty sure he was censoring the author to make him palatable to a 4th century audience that had become, well, much stricter.
So we are literally reading a translation by a guy who admits he tampered with the evidence.
It's messy, and it caused a massive feud with St. Jerome, who's the leading scholar of the day. We'll get into that feud later, but that textual mystery is part of the fun here.
It is.
Our mission today is to look through that filter, the Rufinus filter, let's call it, and try to see the actual mind of Origen. We want to understand the man, the controversy, and then dive into the actual ideas. God as a consuming fire, the nature of the soul, and why we can't physically see God.
It is a journey from the dusty libraries of antiquity to the absolute limits of human thought. So let's start with the man himself, who was Origen.
Origen was born around 185 AD in Alexandria, Egypt, and you really have to understand the landscape here to get him. Alexandria at this time was not just a city.
Right, it was a hub.
It was the intellectual capital of the world. It was the Silicon Valley of ancient philosophy.
I love that comparison. So you've got high intellectual traffic, new ideas, massive collisions of cultures.
Exactly. It was this incredible melting pot of Greek Platonism, Jewish mysticism, Gnosticism, and Christianity. Christianity, you had the Great Library, or at least what was left of it, and you had this intense, buzzing atmosphere of debate. And Origen wasn't just a participant in this, he was a flat-out prodigy.
An absolute prodigy. The sources tell us he took over the famous catechetical school of Alexandria, which is basically becoming the dean of the university at age 18.
18! Think about that.
I can't.
Most 18-year-olds are struggling to organize their laundry or figure out what major to pick, and this guy is running the most important Christian think tank in the known world.
That puts a huge amount of pressure on a kid.
It does. And he didn't exactly have an easy start in life either. His father, Leonidas, was a Christian who was martyred executed for his faith when Origen was just a teenager.
The source material mentions a pretty intense detail here regarding his father's death. Origen actually wanted to go out and die with his dad.
He did. He was zealous. The text says he was with great difficulty prevented from rushing out to join his father in martyrdom. His mother actually hid his clothes so he couldn't leave the house.
She literally grounded him by taking away his clothes. That is, I mean, it's such a human moment in the middle of all this heady ancient history.
It really is. He had this intense desire to witness for his faith from a very young age. He eventually wrote a letter to his father in prison saying, "Don't change your mind because of us." He was entirely ready to be an orphan for the sake of the faith.
Wow. And that intensity never really left him as he grew up. I mean, look at his output. The notes say he wrote nearly 1,000 titles.
Yeah, and some historical estimates go up to 6,000, though that probably counts individual letters and short tracts. But regardless of the exact number, he was a machine.
An ancient content creator.
Truly, he wrote commentaries on almost every single book of the Bible. He wrote homilies, and he produced the Hexapla, which is just a mind-boggling achievement.
I want to pause in the hexapla for a second because in an age before find and replace or, relational database software, this sounds physically impossible. Explain what this was.
It was a massive work of textual criticism. He took the Old Testament and arranged it in 6 parallel columns.
Like a giant spreadsheet.
Like an ancient Excel sheet on parchment, yeah. The first column was the Hebrew text. The second was the Hebrew written out in Greek letters, so you could know the exact pronunciation if you didn't read Hebrew.
Okay, that's clever.
Then the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth columns were different Greek translations of that same text. You had Aquila, Symmachus, the Septuagint, and Theodotion.
So he's building a side-by-side comparison engine, but entirely by hand.
By hand. 50 volumes. It took decades. It required a massive staff of stenographers and copyists just keeping up with him. It was a monument to his absolute obsession with getting to the truth of the text. He wanted to know exactly what God said, down to the syllable.
It's incredible. But despite all this intellectual output, there is a big misconception we need to clear up right now. Modern people often think of Origen as this dry philosopher, maybe a Platonist who just happened to be Christian on the side.
Right, like he was trying to shove Christianity into a Greek philosophical box. There's this lingering idea that he was a Greek philosopher first and a Christian second.
But Henri de Lubac, in his introduction to our source text, argues the exact opposite. He says Origen was a man of the church above all else.
That's a crucial distinction. I highlighted a quote where Origen refers to the church as mother. He didn't see himself as a lone wolf intellectual just theorizing in a vacuum.
He explicitly says, I desire to be and to be called a Christian.
Yes. He wasn't trying to start his own sect. He didn't want to be a master of a school in the sense of a philosophical guru. He viewed himself as a steward of the mysteries. He was deeply pious. In fact, later in life, during the persecution of Decius, he was tortured.
He was stretched on the rack, right?
Yes, and he was an old man by then. They tortured him, stretching him as far as his joints would go, trying to get him to renounce his faith, but he didn't break. He died shortly after from the wounds. So this wasn't an armchair philosopher. He had serious skin in the game.
But he did use philosophy. He loved using logic and Greek thought. He clearly wasn't afraid of it.
He did, but he had a very specific way of justifying it. He used a famous metaphor called the spoils of Egypt.
This is such a crucial concept for understanding how Western thought developed. Break this metaphor down for us.
So he looks back at the book of Exodus. When the Israelites are fleeing slavery in Egypt, God tells them to ask their Egyptian neighbors for gold and silver jewelry. And they do, and they take it with them into the desert. Later, they take that Egyptian gold, melt it down, and use it to build the Holy of Holies in the temple.
So they take the wealth of their oppressors and use it to worship God.
Exactly. Origen says Christians should do the exact same thing with intellectual wealth. We should take the gold of the pagans' logic, geometry, rhetoric, philosophy, and use it to build the temple of Christian theology.
That is such a clever way to reframe it. It's not selling out to the secular culture, it's plundering the enemy for good. It basically validates the study of science and math for a believer.
Right. He says we should take what is useful and just discard the idols, the heresy, or the magic. If Plato has a good point about the nature of the soul, take it, it's gold. Melt it down and use it for the tabernacle. This method, the speculative theology, is exactly what allowed Christianity to become a serious intellectual force. But, and this is the catch, it's also exactly what got him into so much trouble later.
Because when you start speculating, when you start playing with that much fire, you might get burned. You might get it wrong.
Precisely. He was willing to ask questions that nobody else was asking at the time.
And that brings us right back to the trouble with the text itself. We mentioned Rufinus earlier. Let's get deep into the detective story here. Why is the text of On First Principles such a massive mess?
Well, it starts with the fact that Origen was a really bold thinker. He speculated about things like the pre-existence of souls.
Wait, the idea that we existed before we were born.
Yes, that our souls were created before the physical world.
Hmm.
Or he speculated whether the stars had souls, or whether the devil himself could eventually be saved at the end of time.
Which, spoiler alert, became major heresies later on in church history.
Major heresies, correct. So by the time we get to the late 4th century, which is about 150 years after Origen died, the political climate in the church had drastically changed. The definitions of orthodoxy had tightened up, councils had met, people were actively hunting for heretics, and Origen's works were being scrutinized with a magnifying glass.
Enter Rufinus.
Enter Rufinus of Aquileia. He's a monk, a scholar, and he decides he wants to translate Origen into Latin for audiences in the West. But he knows there are huge landmines in the text. He knows that if he translates it literally, word for word, people are going to read it and scream heresy.
So what is his strategy? How does he get around that?
He admits his strategy right in his preface. He says, I found things in Origen's books that contradicted what he said in other places. So Rufinus decides, well, clearly heretics must have inserted those bad parts to frame him.
Oh, that is such a convenient theory. Oh, my favorite author couldn't possibly have meant that crazy thing he wrote. Someone must have hacked his scroll.
Exactly. It's a classic case of denial. Rufinus explicitly states he smoothed over and amended the text. If he found a passage about the Trinity that sounded a bit off by strict 4th century standards, maybe sounding like the Son was slightly less than the Father, which Origen sometimes leaned toward, he fixed it. He made it sound perfectly orthodox.
And this drove St. Jerome absolutely crazy.
It did. And the irony here is rich because Jerome used to love Origen. He called him the greatest teacher after the apostles. They were all Origen fanboys initially.
Right.
But when the winds changed and the Origenist controversy really heated up and it became politically dangerous to, Origen, Jerome panicked. He did not want to be associated with a heretic.
So he threw Origen under the bus.
He threw Origen and Rufinus, his former friend, straight under the bus. Jerome attacked Rufinus viciously for this translation. And then, just to prove how bad Origen truly was, Jerome made his own literal translation of On First Principles. His whole goal was essentially to say, look at these heresies. I'm exposing them. Don't trust Rufinus's nice sanitized version. Look at the ugly truth.
But, and this is the wild part, we don't have Jerome's translation anymore, do we?
Paradoxically, no. Jerome's accurate translation, which was meant to destroy Origen's reputation forever, is lost to history. Rufinus's sanitized, tampered with translation is the one that actually survived.
So we are sitting here reading a version that we know was tampered with to make it sound safer. It's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle where some pieces are missing and others have been painted over by a nervous monk.
That is a perfect description. It's frustrating for historians. However, modern scholars like John Cavadini and Henri de Lubac argue that we shouldn't just throw our hands up and dismiss Rufinus entirely.
Because he kept the core of it intact.
Right. He preserved the structure, the flow, and the vast majority of the philosophical argumentation. And in some specific cases, we do actually have fragments of the original Greek preserved in other ancient anthologies, like a collection called the Philokalia, so we can cross-reference those parts to see how much Rufinus tweaked.
So it's not a total loss. We can still see the shape of the building, even if some of the individual bricks have been replaced.
Exactly. Even through that dense filter, the sheer brilliance of Origen shines through clearly.
So let's get into the building itself. Let's look at the actual book on First Principles. Before he starts building his massive system, Origen lays down some ground rules. He has a preface where he explains the rules of the game.
This is critical for understanding his mindset. Origen distinguishes between two distinct categories: apostolic tradition and speculation.
The must-believes and the maybe-believes.
Precisely. He says there is a definite line of teaching handed down from the apostles themselves. These are the core tenets. These are things you cannot disagree on if you want to call yourself a Christian.
And what exactly is on that non-negotiable list for him?
It's the basics, really. There is one God who created everything out of nothing. Jesus is the Son of God, born of a virgin, suffered, rose from the dead. The Holy Spirit exists and inspires the prophets. The soul has free will and will face a final judgment.
Okay, pretty standard stuff. This is the foundation of the house.
But then, and this is where it gets fascinating, he points out that the apostles delivered the doctrines, but they didn't always explain the how or the why.
They gave you the final answer, but they didn't show the math.
Exactly. And Origen believes that gap is intentional. He says God left those mechanics open specifically so that lovers of wisdom could exercise their minds.
I love that phrase, lovers of wisdom. It makes theology sound less like memorizing a textbook and more like a treasure hunt.
It absolutely is a treasure hunt for him. He even lists specific mysteries that are up for grabs. For example, he says the apostles taught the Holy Spirit exists, but they didn't clarify if the Spirit was begotten or unbegotten, so that's open for debate.
He also mentions the soul, right?
Yes, he says it's not clear from tradition whether the soul is passed down through biological seed-like genetics from your parents, or if a fresh soul is created for each new person, or if it pre-exists in heaven before coming to earth. The church didn't have a hard and fast rule on that yet, so Origen says, great, let's figure it out.
And he asks about the stars.
That is one of my favorite parts of the whole book. He treats it as a totally valid theological question, he asks. Are the sun, moon, and stars living beings? Do they have souls? The church tradition doesn't explicitly say they don't, so Origen says, let's investigate that.
It's so wild to think of a major theologian asking if the sun has a soul. But for him, that's just part of figuring out the system.
And the goal of this entire book is to take those must-believes and use logic, philosophy, and scripture to fill in the maybe-believes, creating one single unified body of doctrine. He wants to connect every single dot.
So let's look at how he starts this massive construction project. Book 1, Chapter 1, he starts with the biggest topic of all, God, the Father.
And immediately, right out of the gate, he has to deal with a major conceptual problem. He is writing in a world where many people, both simple, uneducated believers and highly sophisticated Stoic philosophers, thought of God as having a physical body.
A physical body, like an old man with a beard on a cloud.
Maybe not a body of flesh and bone like ours, but a body made of subtle matter, like fire, or an invisible gas, or pure light. You see, the Stoics believed that everything real was material. If it wasn't matter, it didn't exist. So if God was real, God had to be some kind of super matter.
Well, to be fair to them, the Bible itself does say God is a consuming fire and God is light. If you take that literally as a science textbook, then God is energy or plasma.
Exactly. And Origen says, no, stop right there. We have to read this spiritually, not physically. He goes into what we might call a hermeneutical intervention.
So how does he debunk the God is fire idea? How does he argue against that literal reading?
He uses pure logic. He asks his readers, if God is the consuming fire, what exactly does he consume? Does God burn up physical wood and hay?
That would be a very arsonist view of the Almighty, just God running around setting brush fires.
Right. Origen says, obviously not. God doesn't consume matter. God consumes sin. He consumes evil thoughts and shameful deeds. The fire is a metaphor for spiritual purification, not chemical combustion. He says God enters the soul and burns away the chaff of wickedness.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. But what about God is light? That's straight out of the New Testament. God is light, and in him is no darkness at all.
Origen argues this refers to intellectual light, not physical photons bouncing off objects. He uses the analogy of the sun. The sun illuminates our physical eyes so we can navigate around bodies. God illuminates our minds so we can see truth.
So God is the light bulb of the soul.
In a way, yes, but he pushes it much further. He introduces this concept of God being strictly incorporeal.
The Greek word there is asymaton.
Yes, asymaton, without a body. And Origen admits something pretty startling here. He says, hey, this word isn't actually in the Bible.
That's a really bold admission for a guy whose whole project is building a biblical theology. Here is my core concept, by the way. It's not in the text.
It is bold. He notes that the word appears in an obscure book called The Teaching of Peter, but he quickly admits that's not a canonical book, so it doesn't hold weight. But he argues that the underlying concept is absolutely essential to Scripture, even if the specific Greek term isn't there.
And he uses the story of the Samaritan woman at the well to prove it.
This is a masterclass in exegesis. It's brilliant. Jesus is talking to the woman at the well, and he tells her, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth.
And the context of that conversation was an argument about where to worship, right?
Exactly. The woman asked Jesus, should we worship in Jerusalem like the Jews say, or on this mountain like the Samaritans say? She's thinking entirely in terms of physical location. If God has a body, even a subtle, fiery body, he has to be somewhere. He's either in Jerusalem or he's on the mountain. He has geographic coordinates.
But if God is spirit,
Then he is not limited by space at all. He is everywhere. Jesus totally dismantles the idea of God having a GPS location. And here is Origen's philosophical punchline to all of this. If God were material, he would be composite. He would be made of parts.
why is that distinction so important?
Because anything made of parts can eventually be taken apart. If you are made of atoms or fire or light particles, those parts can be separated. You could be dissolved. You can be destroyed.
So if God had a body, God could theoretically die.
Precisely. Since God is the first principle, the uncreated creator of everything else, he must be totally simple, indivisible, and therefore absolutely bodiless. If he had a body, he would be subject to change. And if he is subject to change, he isn't the eternal God.
Origen uses this really interesting analogy about the mind versus the body to drive this home. He compares our physical senses to our intellect.
He does. He points out a basic physiological fact, or at least a philosophical one that we all experience. Our physical senses have physical objects. Your eyes see color and shape, your ears hear sound waves, your hands feel texture and heat. These are all material physical interactions.
Right.
But the mind, the intellect, perceives things that have no size, no color, no shape. It perceives the concept of justice. It perceives truth. It perceives math.
You can't touch the concept of justice. You can't smell the Pythagorean theorem.
Exactly. And Origen argues, it would be absurd to think that our inferior senses like touch and smell have real objects they interact with, but our superior sense, the mind, interacts with nothing. Therefore, intellectual reality, the invisible world of concepts and truth, is actually more real than the physical world of tables and chairs.
That is very Platonist. The idea that the invisible idea of a thing is more real than the physical thing itself.
It is very Platonist, and he applies it directly to God. God is the ultimate mind, and mind doesn't need physical space to move in. Mind doesn't have a size or a weight.
I really like the point he made in the text about the mind growing. He says the mind doesn't get physically bigger when you learn something new.
Right, when you learn a new language or solve a complex math problem, your physical brain doesn't swell up like a balloon. You don't need to go buy bigger hats when you get a PhD.
Speak for yourself. I feel like my head is exploding sometimes when we do these deep dives.
Well, metaphorically, sure.
Yeah.
But Origen says the mind grows by exercises in learning, not by adding physical matter. Therefore, the very nature of mind is fundamentally different from the nature of body. And since God is the perfection of mind, God cannot be a body.
Okay, so God is invisible. Not just because we have bad eyesight or because he is hiding behind a cloud, but by definition.
Yes, invisible by nature. And this leads to a really nuanced distinction Origen makes between seeing and knowing.
Right. This is a huge part of his argument. Seeing versus knowing. Let's unpack this.
Origen argues that seeing is a strictly physical act. It implies distance. I am over here, the object is over there, and I am directing my gaze at it. There is a separation between the seer and the seen.
Subject and object.
Right. But God isn't an object to be looked at. Origen says that even Jesus, the Son of God, doesn't see the Father in a physical sense.
Wait, even Jesus doesn't see God. That seems super controversial.
It sounds it, but hear him out. Origen says the Son knows the Father. Knowledge is the spiritual, intellectual equivalent of sight. It implies union, intimacy, merging of minds. It's not looking at something from across a room, it's understanding it completely from the inside out.
That reminds me of the Beatitudes, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God.
Exactly. Origen jumps right on that verse to prove his point. He interprets the word heart as mind or intellect. He says we don't see God with our retinas. We see God when our minds are purified from the distraction of physical matter.
So the whole goal of the Christian life, for Origen, is to basically clean the lens of the mind.
Beautifully put, yes. He uses another light analogy here that I think is just great. He says, if you can't look at a tiny lamp without your eyes hurting, You certainly can't go outside and stare directly at the sun.
You do blind.
In the same way, he says if our minds are too weak to even understand the works of God, like how nature operates or why certain things happen in human history, then we certainly aren't ready to understand the essence of God himself. We can only see the rays, not the burning source.
It's very humbling. He's basically saying to his readers, you want to see God, start by trying to understand how a tree grows or how the stars move. If you can't get that right, don't try to look directly at the infinite creator.
And this brings up a really important point about Origen's attitude as a writer. He can sound very intellectual, very elite, but he acknowledges that this stuff is hard. He notes that the Bible constantly uses anthropomorphic language, talking about God's hands, God's wings, God walking in the garden in the cool of the day.
Yeah, the Old Testament is packed with that. God gets angry, God changes his mind, God physically walks around.
Origen doesn't mock the simple believers who take that literally. He isn't arrogant about it. He understands exactly why the Bible talks that way. It's to reach people where they are. He calls it God's condescension. Just as a parent speaks baby talk to a toddler to help them understand, God speaks human to us.
But he doesn't want us to stay toddlers forever.
Exactly. He sees his mission as trying to elevate us, to say, okay, that literal meaning, that was the letter, that got you started, now let's look at the spirit.
It's like moving from a child's crayon drawing of a house to the actual architectural blueprints. The drawing isn't wrong. It conveys the basic idea of a house with a roof and a door. But the blueprint is the actual structural reality.
That is a perfect Origenist analogy. He wants us to graduate to the blueprints. He wants us to see the deep underlying structure of reality itself.
So we've walked through the life of this brilliant, tortured scholar. We've looked at the incredibly messy history of the text, the burning, the translating, the feuding with Jerome. And we've looked at this rigorous philosophical argument that God is a bodiless mind.
It is a lot to take in. It really earns the title of a deep dive.
It absolutely does. So let's bring it down to the ground for a second. What does this all mean for you? Why should you care about a theological text from the 3rd century that barely even survived history?
I think the first big takeaway is seeing that faith and reason were not enemies in the early church.
Yeah, we often have this narrative today that you either have science and logic on one side or you have religion on the other. Like you have to check your brain at the door to believe.
Origen would have found that completely ridiculous. For him, they were partners. He believed God gave us brains specifically so that we could find him. He says the apostles left those gaps in the doctrine, the things they didn't explain, specifically to force us to think.
So theological confusion isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature.
Exactly. It's what he calls the joy of discovery. Think about it. If God explained everything perfectly in a step-by-step manual, we would just be robots following instructions. By leaving mysteries, God invites us to become explorers. He wants us to work for it.
It requires active participation in the faith, rather than just passive consumption.
Secondly, I think it teaches us how to read deeply, whether it's the Bible or any serious piece of literature. Origen challenges us to look beyond the letter, the surface meaning, to the spirit, to ask what is the underlying principle behind this.
Right. Don't just get stuck on the phrase consuming fire and picture a campfire. Ask what is actually being consumed.
Precisely. And finally, there is this incredibly provocative thought that Origen leaves us with. He suggests that our human minds are kin to God.
An intellectual image of the divine.
Yes. If God is ultimately mind and we possess minds, then we actually share a nature. We have a family resemblance to the creator of the universe.
It is a huge statement.
It implies that thinking, learning, investigating the universe, doing science, doing philosophy, none of that is just a secular hobby. It isn't a distraction from spiritual things. For Origen, the very act of thinking is a spiritual act. It is the highest form of worship.
Because when you use your mind to seek truth, you are acting like God.
And you're moving closer to him.
That is a powerful place to land. It turns every moment of curiosity, every question you ask, into a moment of prayer.
I think Origen would completely agree with that.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into the mind of Origen. There is so much more in the story. On First Principles, he goes on to talk about angels, demons, the fall of the soul, and the end of the world. But we will save all of that for another time.
There is always more to learn.
Thanks for listening. Keep thinking, keep questioning.
And keep reading.
Keep diving deep. We'll see you next time.